We've had a wonderful afternoon listening to some stories, personal stories of people who have lived through segregated times in Arlington. We've heard about the history of our country. We've all been exposed to and read The Color of Law, and we've learned about the systematic way, even after federal legislation was passed, that we continue to have persistent segregation and discrimination in our country. And so now, after looking at the history, we have a panel that is going to take us forward a little bit more, hopefully, about what are the policies and the tools that we have in place that can be used both here in Arlington and in other communities in the greater Washington area to help us address the inequality, both the racial and the economic inequality that we have in our communities. So our panelists for today, and I'm not going to read their entire bios, they are in your program. We will begin with Gustavo Velasquez. Gustavo is director of the Urban Institute's Washington Area Research Initiative. So we're going to move right into our discussion. I'm going to begin with Gustavo as we look at what are the tools, the strategies, the initiatives that are going on currently that can help us move forward in our community. Gustavo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, and I want to thank Michelle for inviting me to this important conversation. And it's great to be participating on the panel that is really about proposing solutions. How do we fix this extremely complex? The senator talked about how difficult, how complex this problem of reducing inequality by using every policy lever, every tool at our disposal to increase housing opportunities really across the spectrum of income levels and therefore across the spectrum of communities, different communities by race, ethnicity, and so forth. This is particularly complex in regions like our region that are characterized by high cost of living and where so many people have come here to decide to live in this highly desirable place to live, but that has put enormous market pressures in housing, and that has contributed to compounded levels of inequality because of the high cost of living. And I was asked by Michelle to describe some of the work that I and many, many others, not just in the government, when I was at the Office of Fair Housing at HUD during the Obama administration, but also in the community, many national organizations and local regional organizations together worked on to expand housing opportunities. This was the regulation that in 2015 was promulgated by the Secretary of HUD called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And now some of you who have followed the news knows this is a complicated name. I call it sort of the Fair Housing Rule or the Segregation Rule. Those of you who have followed the news have observed that the Trump administration has been relentless in repealing this national policy. The rule has been suspended now. The incredible amount of data that was produced to help communities overcome segregation and patterns of inequality has been decommissioned. So the question is, why do you want to talk about something that is sort of slowly being rolled back? Well, I want to talk about it because the framework remains, in my view, and in the view of many others, sort of the right approach to fixing many of the problems that urban communities are facing. So if you don't want to call it, the affirmatively furthering fair housing effort or the fair housing rule effort, there are many other organizations that are beginning to sort of use the same framework under different names. In fact, I must admit the Urban Institute, the place I worked on now, which is a national research policy, social and economic research policy organization, has a framing paper called the Opportunities, the Neighborhood Opportunities Initiative. And when you see it, it's sort of basically a very, very similar framework. And the best way, I think, to explain what this is all about is sort of best to exemplify it. And so I'm gonna exemplify it by talking about 3 different distinct communities that you can sort of see in a region like the DC region. One set of communities is those that are characterized by high poverty, high concentration of poverty, typically associated also with high concentrations of racial minorities. And the idea here is that for many, many years, the federal government and local governments have instituted place-based strategies, some that were somewhat successful during the Obama administration, such as maybe you recognize some of the names, choice neighborhoods and promise zones, that were all about going into these highly impoverished, distressed communities, the economically oppressed communities, and really creating the incentives, the public incentives, to generate an influx of private investment to sort of switch this community, to revive this community and create more opportunities for the people that live there. This was really important because when we talk about a concerted place-based or revitalization strategies, we're not just talking about the production of more housing. Developers often like to build housing in this high poverty neighborhood because it's more profitable, land is cheaper, and there are other incentives for developers to build there. But really what we're talking about is place-based strategies that are serious and transform many other things beyond just housing. You know, it's all about improving the quality of the schools, improving the environment, giving people choices for more food and better air and cleaner water. You know, many of the things that many of us take for granted when we choose a place to live. But this is sort of one set of communities that are considered when we think about the policy that we instituted in the kind of the strategies, the concerted revitalization strategies that local government, with help from the federal government, had to select to improve the conditions in those neighborhoods. The second set of communities are the communities that are gentrified. Communities that perhaps in the past were economically distressed, but now have been revived. There's been a great influx of public and private investment. You know, we used to say when we were in the Obama administration that we were really living a century of cities where people finally wanted to come back to the central city, and there was, you know, because of that, a high influx of high-income earners, younger people, wealthier people, whiter people that were coming into the city, and that was creating, you know, the effect of many of these neighborhoods, creating the amenities that produced a gentrifying effect, and with that, a great deal, let's frank, of displacement. We know that in DC you have examples like the Shaw neighborhood and the H. Noma neighborhood. In fact, the recent trends are pointing to the direction that now east of the Anacostia River, the historically black neighborhood of Anacostia is now facing those pressures, is now becoming that gentrified neighborhood. You know, this is geographically a rather small territory, so now that effect of west is moving east, and that is creating the same things that we saw a few years ago in neighborhoods west of the river. And the set of strategies that we needed to implement, that local governments needed to implement there, are really around mostly preservation of affordable housing. It's ensuring through things like locally appropriated housing production trust funds in DC, I don't know if in Arlington, I think in Arlington we do have a local production trust fund. In DC, by the way, DC has the largest per capita housing production trust fund with over $1 million invested every year in the preservation of affordable housing. I think the second largest in the country after New York. And so there's a lot of effort to preserve, to maintain housing affordable in those neighborhoods. It's extremely complex, but there are many other tools. You know, Jared has expertise. He's going to talk about community land trust, but those kinds of tools are important to preserve affordable housing, to ensure that housing retains as much as possible affordable in those highly gentrifying neighborhoods, to prevent as much as possible the high levels of displacement that we've been seeing. And the third group of communities are the communities that we call high opportunity communities. What are the characteristics of those communities? Well, look around. Arlington. I'm not naive, it's not all of Arlington, but it is most of Arlington. I mean, these are highly desirable places to live, where we have, you know, great amenities, more importantly, you know, easy access to transportation, transit, that runs, you know, across the city and the county, great job opportunities, you know, all of the amenities that people really want in a neighborhood when they are looking to select place for their families and themselves. And so, as part of, you know, this national policy, we described an analysis where for those communities, they would need to pay attention to things like where housing was exclusionary, and they needed to be, those communities needed to work on ensuring that zoning had to be more inclusionary, instituting policies to protect, just like in gentrifying areas, tenants, so rent control, rent stabilization. Regions had to look at the availability of vouchers as a matter of sort of regional program and policy option to enable greater mobility, so that people would go to higher opportunity neighborhoods if that's what they wanted. Another very complex and controversial issue. In fact, when the senator was saying earlier that on the funding side, Congress actually was able to restore the funding that the White House proposed, a terrible budget for housing programs with severe cuts, and Congress was able to restore that. But when he said, well, Congress was in agreement with restoring some of the funding, but it couldn't get an agreement around things like the affirmatively funding for housing. That's because there was an intentional misconstruction, misinterpretation, that this national policy was only about that third set of communities that I was referring to, that it was about the federal government imposing changes in local zoning being a matter of local control and local decision making, and that's what, you know, even Secretary Carson called, before becoming secretary, social engineering. There was like forced integration of communities, minority communities, into high opportunity areas. And that's what, you know, they got stuck into believing that this policy was just about that. And they didn't see the whole context of what this policy was trying to do. So when you think about these sets of three communities, and you have data available to regions and local jurisdictions where they see patterns of segregation, patterns of resegregation. The person that in the earlier panel said, you know, there is an effect of suburbanization of poverty, where now poverty is becoming more concentrated in the suburbs. There's a resegregation effort in the last few years because of the high cost of the central city. So the data was giving local communities the opportunity to see those patterns of existing historic segregation and new segregation, layering on top of that issues like the quality of the schools and the issues that matter to people, again, in neighborhoods, and conduct a comprehensive regional analysis of those types of neighborhoods, and then proposing to the federal government a set of strategies that would be tied to decision making on how they're going to invest billions of dollars in housing and community development programs on a yearly basis. That's another reason why this policy was so difficult. This policy was attempted twice before the Obama administration, and it failed because mayors and governors hate to have someone second guess the decisions that they're making on how they're conducting housing and community development programs. And this was really pretty much about that, not second guessing, but really having people, experts in this problem, assess whether cities and suburban communities, local communities were doing the right type of analysis and selecting the right type of strategies based on these three sets of communities. And obviously, the approval of these plans and the approval of these strategies would have an impact, a decisive impact in the levels of federal funding that they would obtain. So it was a policy, in my view, the right framework, because you had, the carrot and the stick approach. You did have the ability to make decisions locally with strong community involvement. That's another aspect of this, that HUD, when approving these plans and approving the money, would have to ensure that there was strong community participation in the decision making of these strategies. Without that, these plans would be, I don't think would be very productive. And so the policy was very intentional about community engagement. And so this is sort of something that, in my view, is still the right framework. We'll see what happens in the DC region. By the way, the Metropolitan Council of Government worked with all the jurisdictions, DC taking the lead, and surrounding jurisdictions to conduct a regional analysis and to propose regional strategies. This happened right before the rule was suspended. So right now, the situation is we don't know what is going to happen if jurisdictions now, they think, okay, well, now we can, rest back and maybe we don't need to work as comprehensively as we should have done under the rule. But I feel confident in many cities in California, Mayor de Blasio in New York, other cities have decided to take, to say, we are going to do this. This is the right type of work that we need to conduct. And it needs to be regional. In many places it is. They are taking a regional approach to this. And so we'll see what happens in the DC region. I feel optimistic that something will come out productively of this. This is, by the way, I'm not by any means suggesting that luring, Amazon into the area, it's a good thing. It will actually exponentially exacerbate the problem of housing. But on the other hand, I was thinking about this last night. There's been a lot of involvement from the private sector into fixing the metro problem because they need to fix it before Amazon decides where to go. And so the next thing that they need to tackle is housing. And so I think there is momentum right now for the business community, the philanthropic community, and local governments, and both governors who have been very proactive in trying to get Amazon to their respective states. There is a momentum to take this opportunity, and again, the framework is there. We just need to do it, and I feel optimistic that we may fix this.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think, like so many other things that have been happening at the federal level that have changed the trajectory of where this country wants to go, be it the environment or immigration questions, I, like you, am hopeful that even though this rule has been suspended, because we have efforts regionally, that communities will continue to look to perfect this and to do a better job on this. So we hope for that.